Dear students, as part of population policies and programs, we will now try to understand the perceptions of national governments regarding population issues. In this module, we will try to understand the perceptions of the national governments about population size and growth, population aging, fertility, adolescent fertility, reproductive health, health and mortality, spatial distribution and internal migration, and finally, the perceptions of the national governments about international migration. This gives us a clear understanding of the kind of initiatives taken up by various governments to address the population related issues covering fertility, mortality, health, migration and urbanization. All of us would remember that ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, held in 1994, was a landmark event in the population field. Post ICPD, several governments have taken initiatives to address population and development issues. Several new population patterns and trends have also emerged after the ICPD conference. These issues require renewed, differentiated policies and program efforts at national as well as international levels. In particular, we should talk about the reports prepared by UN Population Division. This report makes use of the information that is available on views and perceptions of the governments with regard to policies on population issues, and this information is gathered as a basis of World Population Policy Database. This database as well as the report document changes in population policies and related indicators during 1976 and 2013. The report covers all the 193 member states, 2 observer states and 2 non-member states of the United Nations. Let us understand the perceptions of the national governments with regard to population size and growth. Many governments in less developed regions started realizing the importance of reducing high rates of population growth. Number of governments in more developed regions as well expressed their concern about low rates of population growth and population aging taking place in their respective countries. In 2013, 26 of the 83 governments with population growth rates below 1% recorded during 2010-15 were not intervening to influence their growth rate, and of the 18 countries with negative population growth rates recorded during 2010-15, all except Bosnia and other country had policies to raise the population growth rate. Let us have a look at the figure 1, which gives the percentage of governments with policies to influence rate of population growth by level of development during 1996 to 2013. Here we divided the countries. In fact, the UN Population Division divides the countries into 2 categories: more developed regions and less developed regions. The chart gives a comparative picture in terms of perceptions of the governments with regard to population growth from 1996 to 2013. As we can observe from this chart, the governments with policies to raise the rate of population growth has increased considerably from 1996 to 2013 in case of more developed regions. On the other hand, in case of less developed regions, the percentage of governments with policies to reduce the rate of population growth more or less remained the same. It is around 48, 49 kind of thing. So, in a nutshell, about 50%, almost half of the countries from more developed regions have policies to raise the rate of population growth, whereas about half of the countries from less developed regions have policies to reduce the rate of population growth. The same scenario one can observe for the period 1976 to 2013 for the world, for more developed regions and other regions of the world, in terms of the kind of initiatives, the kind of policy initiatives to address the population growth, namely efforts to raise the population growth, maintain the population growth or reduce the population growth, or no intervention at all. So, the table gives the number as well as percentages. If you take the percentages from 1976, the percentage of countries that had population policy to increase the population growth rate moved from 19 to 20 across the world, whereas in case of the more developed regions it increased from 24 to 49. The percentage of countries to have policy initiatives to reduce the population growth rate has increased from 26 to 37% in case of the world as a whole, whereas in case of more developed regions it increased from 0 to 2%. Continuing on the same table, if you look at the results for less developed regions and least developed regions, the efforts to maintain the same population growth rate increased from 0 to 23% in case of less developed regions, while it increased from 0 to 8% in case of least developed countries. On the other hand, efforts to reduce the population growth rate, there is substantial increase in case of less developed as well as least developed regions, from 34% to 49% in case of less developed regions and 14% to 70% in case of least developed regions. Let us talk about the perceptions of the national governments with regard to population aging. Population aging is an emerging issue in many of the developing countries, but it is an important issue, a crucial matter to be addressed in case of many of the developed countries. Among all the 189 countries for which information was available, governments of 61 countries accounting for about 47% changed their statutory retirement age, and governments of 89 countries accounting for 38% reformed their pension systems as well to address the issues and implications of population aging. In this figure 2, we have the percentage of governments that considered population aging as a major concern. Here the classification is by level of development, and then the reference period was 2005 and 2013. In case of all the countries, in 2005, 52% of the countries were having consideration of population aging as a major concern. It went up to 55% in 2013. On the other hand, in case of more developed regions, the percentage of countries that considered population aging as a major concern went up from 76 to 92% between 2005 and 13. In case of less developed regions, where population aging is still an emerging issue, the percentage remained almost same. About 43-42% of the countries in the less developed region considered population aging as a major concern. And if you look at the figure 3, that indicates the kind of measures adopted by governments in the last 5 years so as to address the population aging by level of development. The reference period was 2013. This is from United Nations publication on world population policies. This is a publication brought out by Department of Economic and Social Affairs Population Division of the United Nations. The initiatives listed here include change in statutory retirement age, pension system reform, or both or none of the two. If you look at more developed regions, there is substantial considerable effort in terms of various activities that include change in statutory retirement age, pension system, but more than half of the countries have adopted both the measures, change in statutory retirement age as well as pension system reform. In case of least developed regions, almost more than half of the countries have none of the measures adopted, whereas only 1/4 of the countries adopted pension system and 15% of the countries from less developed regions adopted both change in statutory retirement age as well as pension system reform. We have seen the measures adopted by the governments in the last 5 years from 2008 to 2013 in response to population aging by level of development. Now, let us understand the government's level of concern about issues relating to aging of population, and the table 3 gives the analysis of this data, the extent of concern in terms of response to population aging issues, namely major concern, minor concern and not at all a concern. Across the world, almost half of the countries, 52 in 2005 and 55 in 2013 in terms of percentages, expressed concern about major concern about aging of population in their countries across the world. In case of more developed regions, 76% were expressing major concern in 2005, and this percentage went up to 92 in case of more developed regions by 2013. On the other hand, in case of less developed regions, it remained almost same or it reduced slightly. About 43-42% of the governments from the less developed regions were having major concern about aging of the population. In case of least developed regions, it reduced from 26% to 18% from 2005 to 13, with in case of the countries having major concern about aging of the population. Continuing on this, the table 4 gives the government's level of concern of aging on population by major area, in terms of geographical regions like Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, North America and Oceania. There are interesting differentials here. By and large, the African countries, they seem to be having minor concern about population aging. Same is true for Asia, whereas in case of Europe, 91% of the countries in 2013 were having major concern about population aging. This is expected because of the fall in fertility rates and increase in elderly population and reduction in the proportion of youth population. All these factors led to this kind of policy response from the countries and the governments from the European countries. On the other hand, Latin America and Caribbean also fall in the same category in terms of having major concern. The percentage changed from 64% in 2005 to 73% in 2013. North America, it is universal. Oceania, again it increased from 17 to 31% between 2005 and 13, with the major concern expressed about population aging in their country. And then let us look at table 5 that tells us about the kind of initiatives adopted by the national governments in response to the population aging and the emergent issues. In the 5 years period between 2008 and 2013, across the world 25% of the countries adopted both changes in statutory retirement age and pension system reform, and this percentage is much higher in case of the more developed regions, namely 53% of the more developed region countries adopted both the measures in response to population aging issues. On the other hand, only 15% of the countries from less developed regions and 7% of the countries from least developed region adopted both the measures. By and large, the less developed and least developed countries have not adopted any of these two measures. Table 6 gives the same result in case of different regions of the country like Africa, Asia, Europe and all. In Africa, 8% of the countries adopted both the measures, namely change in statutory retirement age and pension system reform. In Asia, 19% of the countries adopted both the measures, while 43% did not adopt any of the measures. Europe, as expected, 57% of the countries adopted both the measures, while 14% each adopted change in statutory retirement age as well as pension system reform. We have just discussed about the kind of response from the national governments to the emergent issues in the light of population aging in their respective countries. Let us now move to the fertility levels and the kind of response from the national governments to the fertility situation in their respective countries. Most of the more developed countries that have completed fertility transition and they are experiencing below replacement fertility level. On the other hand, many of the less developed countries, particularly from Africa and Asia, are still experiencing moderate to high levels of fertility. Let us try to understand the perceptions of the national governments with regard to adolescent fertility. More and more governments started expressing their concern about high rates of adolescent fertility. The adolescent fertility means the fertility among adolescents, which is increasing of late in many of the countries irrespective of their development stage. In view of that, the percentage of governments that express the major concern about level of adolescent fertility has increased from 46% in 1996 to 67% in 2013. That means 2/3 of the countries have expressed their concern, major concern rather, about the level of adolescent fertility in their countries in 2013. 9 out of 10 governments had policies to reduce adolescent fertility, while 6 out of 10 were having so in 1996. The governments in more developed regions as well as the less developed regions increasingly have adopted policies to reduce adolescent fertility. Then let us understand the perceptions of the governments with relation to family planning. In 2013, more than 9 out of 10 governments in Latin America and Caribbean, Africa and Oceania provided direct support to family planning. That means more than 90% of the countries have supported family planning measures directly, whereas less than half of the governments did so in case of Europe, 45% only. That is expected, as we have seen in the earlier tables and charts. In Africa, only one country did not support family planning. It was 4 in case of 1996. So, it reduced from 4 to 1 during 1996 to 2013. In Africa, the governments providing direct support to family planning has increased substantially. As a result of that, we have only one country that is not providing direct support to family planning in 2013. Then another important related indicator is abortion. In case of abortion, as on 2013, 2/3 of the countries allowed or permitted abortion only when physical or mental health of the mother was endangered. In about half of the countries, only when pregnancy is resulted from a rape or other incident or any issues related to the fetus, only abortion was permitted. Let us continue the perceptions about abortion. 97% of the governments permitted abortion to save a woman's life as on 2013. There are very few exceptions in this regard. Some of the countries did not allow or did not permit abortion under any circumstances. And then since 1996, more and more countries have started liberalizing their abortion policies. And then what kind of abortion policy initiatives are there? Abortion policies are much more restrictive in developing countries compared to the developed countries. The statistics available as on 2013 indicates that 86% of the countries in more developed regions allowed abortion when pregnancy resulted from rape or any other incident or any issues related to fetus are there, and this percentage is 40% only in case of less developed regions. Let us move to the child mortality and under 5 mortality situation and the perceptions of the governments to address the issues related to child and under 5 mortality. As on 2013, more governments perceived the level of child mortality in their countries as acceptable, whereas 2/3 of the governments, 65%, considered the level of under 5 mortality in their respective countries as unacceptable. That means the countries considered the child mortality to be acceptable, means the child mortality levels are not so high or are acceptable, whereas under 5 mortality levels are of a major concern. Continuing on the child and under 5 mortality, proportion of governments considering under 5 mortality unacceptable is higher in the less developed regions, 78% compared to only 27% in more developed regions. The obvious reasons for this is that the less developed regions are having higher levels of under 5 mortality, whereas the more developed regions are having very low levels of under 5 mortality. It depends on the level of under 5 mortality, and all the 49 governments of the least developed countries perceived that the under 5 mortality in their country is unacceptable. Another important area for intervention from policy and program point of view is maternal mortality. Though maternal mortality has been declining in many of the countries, most of the governments in less developed regions consider the level in their country as unacceptable. There is decline in trend. In spite of the decline in trend, the concern is that the level of maternal mortality in the countries is unacceptable, unacceptably high. In 2013, 76% of the governments in less developed regions compared to 96% in the least developed region, they considered level of maternal mortality as unacceptable. Let us move to the health sector and the perceptions of the governments about health related issues. In 2013, 80% of the governments expressed major concern about HIV/AIDS in their countries, and this was again reported more in case of less developed regions, 83% compared to 71% in the more developed regions. In case of least developed countries, all governments of the least developed countries considered HIV/AIDS to be a major concern. And then let us understand the kind of measures adopted in response to the issues related to HIV/AIDS by various governments. many governments have adopted measures to address the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and then the kind of measures adopted by the respective governments include routine blood screening, condom distribution, provision of ART, prevention of mother to child transmission, and anti-discrimination legal measures. But in 2013, only 1/3 of the countries lacked any legal provision to prevent discrimination against people living with HIV. That means, still there are no legal measures to prevent discrimination against people living with HIV in 1/3 of the countries. There is a gap here in terms of policy measures and initiatives to address the issues related to HIV/AIDS. Let us move to spatial distribution. In 2013, only 10% of the governments were satisfied with the current spatial distribution of the population in their country. 60% of the governments were in favor of a major change in their spatial distribution. It was 42% only in 1996. That means, there is an increase in desire to have major change in the spatial distribution among the countries and national governments. Let us continue the discussion on spatial distribution. In 2013, higher proportion of governments in less developed regions, 70%, felt the need for major change in the spatial distribution of the population, and it was only 29% in case of more developed regions. In 2013, of the 185 governments with available data, 80%, 4/5, 4 out of 5 countries had policies to reduce rural to urban migration. This again an increase from 38% in 1996. So, more and more governments as on 2013 have started policy initiatives to reduce or to have decline in rural to urban migration. Continuing on that, proportion of governments with policies to lower or reduce rural to urban migration was higher in less developed regions compared to more developed regions. See, the policy initiatives obviously depend on the kind of situation that is prevailing, the kind of issues that are emerging, the kind of implications the changes in the demographic patterns are causing. So, the whatever difference is noticed between the less developed regions and more developed regions has to be understood from the context point of view, the situation prevailing in the respective countries. These factors lead to this kind of policy responses. Then let us move to the perceptions with respect to international migration. The number of international migrants worldwide reached 232 million in 2013, which is a huge jump from 154 million in 1990, and the growth rate was 1.6% per year. In view of these alarming statistics, more number of governments are open now to regular immigration in recent years. And then continuing on the perceptions about immigration, 3/4 of the governments had policies to maintain level of immigration, or they were not intervening to change the level of immigration. On the other hand, 15% of the governments had policies to reduce the level of immigration. On the other hand, 11% of the governments had policies to enhance the level of immigration. This may be due to the labor shortage and over aging of the population, these kind of factors, and then considerable reduction in the youth population. These kind of situations will lead to the policy response to enhance the level of immigration by some of the governments. And then the percentage of governments with policies to reduce the immigration. This declined from 40% in 96 to 15% in 2013. That means the restrictions towards reducing immigration have started declining. More and more governments have started relaxing the immigration policies. The percentage of governments seeking to enhance immigration increased from 4% in 96 to 11% in 2013. During 96 to 2013, the percentage of governments seeking to reduce immigration declined substantially in more developed as well as less developed regions. On the other hand, the percentage of governments seeking to raise immigration went up in more developed regions from 2% to 24%, but that kind of increase was not recorded in case of less developed regions. And the percentage of governments with policies to raise immigration of highly skilled workers, this has increased from 22% in 2005 to 40% in 2013. This indicates that more and more governments are in favor of immigration of skilled workers, because there is shortage of labor and other issues are there. These issues have to be addressed. So, this is the kind of policy response to address those issues. In line with this, majority of the governments recognize that successful integration of migrants into host society is also essential, so as to maximize the opportunities that are available by migration. So, the integration of immigrants and the native population is very essential, and good that many governments have recognized this and then they have started policy initiatives towards this. While talking about integration of non-nationals and the national population, 63% of the governments had policies to promote this kind of integration, which was only 44% in 1996. In 2013, 95% of the governments in more developed regions had policies to promote integration of non-nationals. This is the need of the hour. As we discussed a few minutes back, the kind of policy responses are in accordance with the kind of needs that are there for the people living in these countries, and the response of the government is in line with the kind of policy initiatives that are needed to ensure welfare of the people living there. In case of less developed regions, it is only 49%, and in case of least developed countries, 29% had such kind of initiatives to have integration of migrants and the host country population. So far, we discussed about the kind of policy responses of the national governments towards the population related issues. We started with the kind of responses of the success of the respective governments at the national level on the basis of the UN publications. We discussed about the kind of initiatives, the kind of perceptions towards population growth, how many are in favor of reducing the population growth, how many are in favor of enhancing the population growth, how many are in favor of maintaining the current population growth. The reference period was 2013. We also had comparative picture from 1976 to 2013. Then we looked into the kind of measures and the perceptions from policy point of view with regard to population aging, the kind of initiatives, pension systems, enhancing the retirement age kind of initiatives. Then we looked into mortality related, child mortality, infant mortality related concerns from the respective national governments. Then we looked into spatial distribution, migration, immigration and other related issues and policy response to these issues from the successive governments. So, this module has provided an understanding to all of us about the kind of policy response from the countries, from the national governments towards population and its related issues and implications, and one has to keep in mind about the trends that are there, the patterns that are there, the changes in the trends, the changes in the patterns, and the needs in terms of policy and program intervention, and the response from the national governments to address the needs for the policy and program intervention. So, this has provided us holistic understanding of the scenario in this regard. So, our knowledge must have been enriched in terms of policy responses of the successive governments.